It's 3:19 a.m. Just hours after prom, 16-year-old Zephyr Quillen should be home asleep, dreaming about his future. Instead, flashing red and blue lights surround his house as he's rushed to the hospital, his body burning with fever, his life unraveling because of a secret no one saw coming, a secret that would shatter his family and end in cold-blooded murder. Tonight, we uncover the twisted relationship between a stepson and his stepmother that turned a night of celebration into a nightmare of betrayal. This is not just a story about a crime. This is a story about how far someone will go to protect a lie, and how that lie became a death sentence. Before we continue with this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Zephyr Quillen was everything a small-town kid should be. Honor roll student, varsity track runner, working part-time at his uncle's auto shop to save money for college. He lived in the picturesque town of Brookhaven with his father Robert, a respected electrician, and his stepmother Victoria, who everyone knew as the woman who brought light back into Robert's life after his first wife died in a car accident when Zephyr was just 11. On the surface, they were the perfect blended family. Victoria volunteered at the church bake sales, attended Zephyr's track meets, and seemed to genuinely care about the boy who had lost his mother too young. But beneath this facade of normalcy, something much darker was taking root. By the end of this story, you'll discover how a prom night celebration became the catalyst for revealing a secret that would cost Zephyr everything. You'll learn why a woman who promised to protect a grieving child became his predator, and you'll understand how betrayal, when mixed with desperation, can turn deadly. The questions that haunted investigators for months were simple yet chilling. How does a mother figure destroy the very child she's supposed to protect? Why did Zephyr have to die to keep her secret safe? And could this tragedy have been prevented if anyone had seen the warning signs? Zephyr Quillen wasn't supposed to be at Brookhaven High School's senior prom alone, but his girlfriend Sophia had come down with the flu 2 days before the big night. Most kids would have skipped it entirely, but Zephyr had been looking forward to this night for months. He'd saved up from his job at Quillen Auto Services, owned by his uncle, not his father, to rent a navy blue tuxedo that made him look older than his 16 years. His friends Alex and Diego had convinced him to come anyway, promising they'd make sure he had a good time. Zephyr was the kind of kid who made friends easily. His teachers described him as quietly confident, the type of student who helped struggling classmates with math homework and never made them feel stupid for needing help. He carried himself with the slight awkwardness of someone who'd grown 4 inches in the past year, but his genuine smile and tendency to listen more than he talked made him popular with both his peers and adults. Robert Quillen had done his best to raise Zephyr alone after his wife Laura died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver on Route 42. For 3 years, father and son had navigated grief together, eating too much takeout and learning to do laundry the hard way. Robert worked long hours as an electrical contractor, often leaving Zephyr to fend for himself after school, but the bond between them was strong. Zephyr inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's compassionate nature, creating a young man who seemed destined for good things. When Robert met Victoria Lang at a church singles event in 2020, Zephyr was 14 and initially suspicious of any woman who might try to replace his mother. But Victoria was patient, kind, and never pushed too hard for Zephyr's acceptance. She was 34, 8 years younger than Robert, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to light up when she laughed. She'd moved to Brookhaven from Denver after a messy divorce, claiming she wanted a fresh start in a smaller town where people still knew their neighbors. Victoria integrated herself into their lives gradually. She started by bringing dinner over on weekends when Robert was working late, claiming she'd made too much for just herself. She attended Zephyr's track meets, cheering louder than some of the actual parents. When Robert and Victoria married in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church in the summer of 2021, Zephyr walked her down the aisle, symbolically giving his blessing to the union. The gesture made the local newspaper social section with the headline, "Blended Family Finds New Beginnings." For nearly 2 years, everything seemed perfect. Victoria maintained the house with an attention to detail that impressed the neighborhood wives. She planted flower gardens that bloomed in carefully orchestrated succession throughout the growing season. She hosted barbecues that brought together Robert's work friends and their families. She even helped Zephyr with his college applications, researching scholarship opportunities and proofreading his essays. But there were moments, small at first, when something felt off. Zephyr's friend Alex later told investigators about times when Victoria would touch Zephyr's shoulder for just a moment too long, or how she'd find excuses to be in his room when he was doing homework. There were the text messages that started innocuously enough, reminding him about doctor's appointments or asking if he needed anything from the grocery store, but gradually became more frequent and personal. She'd ask about girls he liked, offering advice about dating that made him uncomfortable. When Zephyr turned 16 in April, Victoria gave him a gift that surprised everyone, an expensive watch that seemed too intimate for a stepmother to give. Robert had seemed pleased, proud that his wife cared so much about his son, but Zephyr felt something was wrong with the gesture. He couldn't articulate what bothered him about it, so he said nothing. The warning signs were there, hidden in plain sight, like they so often are. Victoria had begun staying up late, claiming insomnia, and would often be in the kitchen when Zephyr came home from his evening shifts at the auto shop. She'd offer him leftover dinner and want to talk about his day, his friends, his dreams. These conversations felt different from the casual check-ins of his early childhood, or even the awkward getting-to-know-you period when she first joined their family. There was an intensity to her attention that made Zephyr uncomfortable, but he attributed it to her trying too hard to be a good stepmother. He'd lost his mother so young that he had no real reference point for what a normal mother-son relationship should look like as he approached adulthood. Victoria's interest in his life felt suffocating at times, but Zephyr convinced himself that this was just what having a mother figure was supposed to feel like. He couldn't have known that Victoria was grooming him, slowly, breaking down boundaries and normalizing inappropriate intimacy. He couldn't have known that her late-night availability wasn't maternal concern, but predatory calculation. And he certainly couldn't have known that behind her perfect stepmother facade, Victoria was hiding a devastating secret that would change everything. Brookhaven High School's 2023 senior prom was held at the Lakeside Manor, a sprawling venue 20 minutes outside of town that the school had booked for the past 15 years. The theme was Midnight in Paris, and the decorating committee had transformed the ballroom with twinkling lights and artificial Eiffel Tower centerpieces that looked more impressive in the dim lighting than they probably should have. Zephyr arrived at 7:30 with Alex and Diego, all three boys in matching navy tuxedos they'd rented from the same shop. Despite Sophia's absence, Zephyr found himself having a good time. He danced with Olivia Jenkins, Alex's date's best friend, and even worked up the courage to ask Hannah Lee, the quiet girl from his AP history class, for a slow dance during the last song. The photography showed Zephyr laughing, his face relaxed and genuinely happy in a way that his friends would remember when everything fell apart. The original plan had been for Zephyr to spend the night at Alex's house with a group of friends, but at 10:30, as the dance was winding down, Zephyr received a text from Victoria. His phone lit up with her message. "Your dad had to respond to an emergency call at the Wilson construction site. I'm coming to pick you up instead. Meet me in the parking lot in 15 minutes. Zephyr showed the message to Alex and Diego, who were disappointed but understood. Robert often had to work late when electrical problems arose at construction sites, and it made sense that Victoria would step in. Zephyr gathered his things, said goodbye to his friends, and walked out to the manor's parking lot to wait. He stood under one of the decorative lampposts, checking his phone and enjoying the cool spring air after hours in the stuffy ballroom. Victoria's silver Honda Accord pulled up at exactly 11. She was dressed more casually than Zephyr had expected, wearing jeans and a fitted black sweater instead of her usual put-together appearance. Her makeup was heavier than normal, and there was something in her demeanor that felt different, more energetic and confident than her usual measured approach. "How was the dance?" she asked as Zephyr climbed into the passenger seat, but her tone suggested she was distracted by other thoughts. Zephyr buckled his seatbelt and began telling her about the evening, about dancing with Olivia, and how the decorations had actually looked pretty good, but Victoria seemed to only half listen. Instead of taking the direct route home down Pine Road, she turned onto the winding back roads that led toward the pond on the other side of town. "Where are we going?" Zephyr asked, confused by the detour. "I thought we could stop somewhere and talk," Victoria said, her voice taking on a quality that Zephyr had never heard before. "You're graduating in 3 weeks, heading to college in the fall. We never really get time alone together, just the two of us." Something about the way she said alone together made Zephyr's stomach tighten with unease. He suggested they could talk at home, but Victoria shook her head, saying his father wouldn't be back until very late, and they had plenty of time. She pulled into the parking area at Willow Pond, a secluded spot popular with teenagers, but empty on this weeknight. The moon reflected off the water, creating an almost romantic atmosphere that made Zephyr deeply uncomfortable. Victoria turned off the engine, but left the radio playing softly, some slow song he didn't recognize. "Zephyr," she said, turning to face him in the driver's seat. "You know I care about you, right? You know you can trust me with anything." What happened next in that car would haunt Zephyr for the rest of his short life. Victoria began talking about how handsome he looked in his tuxedo, how proud she was of the young man he'd become, how she'd noticed girls at school looking at him with interest. Her words were inappropriate, but it was her actions that crossed every line imaginable. She reached over and touched his face, telling him he reminded her of his father when Robert was younger. Zephyr tried to pull away, but Victoria moved closer, saying she wanted to show him how much she cared about him. The details of what followed are too disturbing to describe in full, but what's important to understand is that Zephyr, despite being 16 and physically capable of resistance, was completely unprepared for this betrayal by the woman he trusted as a mother figure. Victoria used her position of authority, her knowledge of his insecurities, and his natural confusion about physical intimacy to manipulate him into a situation that would destroy his life. Zephyr would later tell a crisis counselor that the worst part wasn't the physical violation, though that was traumatic enough.
The worst part was how Victoria framed what happened, telling him it was natural, that it was what people who cared about each other did, that it was their special secret that would bring them closer as a family. She drove him home afterward as if nothing had happened, chatting about his upcoming graduation and making plans for a family celebration. Zephyr sat in the passenger seat, his formal wear feeling like a costume now, his mind reeling with confusion and shame. When they arrived home, Robert's truck was already in the driveway. "Remember," Victoria said as they walked to the front door, "this is just between us. Your father wouldn't understand." The implied threat in her words was clear. Speaking up would destroy not just Victoria, but Robert and the family they'd worked so hard to build. Zephyr went to his room that night and didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand how the woman who'd attended his track meets and helped him with college applications could do something so awful to him. He thought about calling Alex or Diego, but what would he say? He thought about confronting Victoria, but she'd made it clear that speaking up would have consequences. Most devastatingly, he thought about telling his father, but the idea of destroying Robert's happiness, of tearing apart their family again, felt impossible. Zephyr was trapped by his own compassion, his desire to protect the people he loved, and his inability to comprehend that he was not responsible for Victoria's actions. He fell asleep as dawn was breaking, exhausted and traumatized, believing that he was somehow complicit in his own abuse. He had no way of knowing that Victoria had been planning this for months, waiting for the right opportunity to act on desires that had nothing to do with love or care, and everything to do with power and control.
If you're still watching, drop a comment with the word "still here." Let's see how many of you are locked into this story. 3 days after prom, Zephyr woke up feeling like he was coming down with the flu. His body ached, he had a low-grade fever, and he felt exhausted despite sleeping more than usual. Victoria suggested he stay home from school, bringing him soup and checking on him with the same maternal concern she'd always shown. But there was something different in her attention now, a possessiveness that made Zephyr's skin crawl. She would sit on the edge of his bed longer than necessary, touching his forehead to check for fever with hands that lingered too long. When Robert asked about Zephyr's illness, Victoria was quick to reassure him that it was probably just stress from upcoming finals and graduation. She volunteered to take Zephyr to the doctor if he didn't improve, an offer that terrified Zephyr for reasons he couldn't articulate. By Friday, Zephyr felt worse instead of better. He'd developed a persistent cough and night sweats that left his sheets soaked. His lymph nodes were swollen, and he had a rash on his chest that looked like nothing he'd ever seen before. Victoria drove him to Dr. Ellis's office, insisting on coming into the examination room with him, despite Zephyr's protests that he was old enough to see the doctor alone. Dr. Ellis, who'd known Zephyr since childhood, noted the symptoms and asked standard questions about recent activities, stress levels, and potential exposure to illness. When he asked if Zephyr was sexually active, Victoria answered for him, saying no, absolutely not, and Zephyr was too confused and ashamed to correct her. Dr. Ellis prescribed rest and fluids, suggesting it was likely a viral infection that would resolve itself, but Zephyr didn't get better. Over the following week, his symptoms worsened dramatically. The fever spiked higher, he lost his appetite entirely, and he began having trouble concentrating during his few attempts to attend school. His friend Alex noticed the change immediately. "Dude, you look terrible," Alex said during lunch on Tuesday. "Like really sick. Maybe you should go to the hospital." Zephyr brushed off the concern, but privately he was beginning to panic. Something was seriously wrong with him, and the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. The symptoms had started exactly 3 days after prom night, exactly 3 days after Victoria he couldn't even think about what had happened without feeling sick to his stomach. Sophia Martinez, who'd finally recovered from her own bout with the flu, stopped by Zephyr's house on Wednesday evening to check on him. She was shocked by his appearance. Zephyr had lost noticeable weight, his skin had a grayish pallor, and he seemed to be shivering despite the warm June weather. "Zephyr, you need to go to the emergency room," Sophia insisted. "This isn't normal sick, this is something else." Victoria, who'd answered the door and hovered nearby during their conversation, quickly disagreed. She assured Sophia that Zephyr was just run down from the stress of senior year and would be fine with more rest. But Sophia's visit planted a seed of courage in Zephyr. Someone outside his family had noticed how sick he was, had validated that his symptoms were serious. Maybe it was time to speak up. That night, Zephyr called Alex from his bedroom phone, speaking in whispers, even though his father was working late again. "I need to tell you something," Zephyr said, his voice shaking. "But you have to promise not to tell anyone until I figure out what to do," Alex promised. And Zephyr took a deep breath before saying the words that would change everything. "Victoria did something to me after prom in the car, and I think she made me sick." The conversation lasted 2 hours with Alex listening in shocked silence as Zephyr described what had happened. Alex's initial reaction was disbelief. Victoria seemed so normal, so caring. But as Zephyr continued talking, providing details that no 16-year-old should know about adult sexuality, Alex realized his friend was telling the truth. Alex convinced Zephyr to talk to his older sister, Elena, who was a nurse at the county hospital. Elena listened to Zephyr's story with professional calm, asking gentle questions about his symptoms and the timeline of events. When Zephyr described the night sweats, swollen lymph nodes, and persistent fever, Elena felt a chill of recognition. "Zephyr," she said carefully, "I think you need to get tested for some things, specific things, and I think you need to tell your dad what happened." Zephyr begged Elena not to say anything, terrified of destroying his family. But Elena explained that some secrets were too dangerous to keep. She offered to help him tell Robert to be there for support. And slowly Zephyr began to realize that he wasn't alone in this nightmare. The confrontation with Robert happened on a Saturday morning in late June. Zephyr had asked his father to sit down in the living room, saying he had something important to discuss. Victoria was at the farmer's market, giving them privacy that Zephyr desperately needed. With Elena sitting beside him for support, Zephyr looked at his father and said, "Dad, something happened on prom night. Something bad with Victoria." The words tumbled out in a rush, punctuated by tears and apologies, as Zephyr described the betrayal that had destroyed his sense of safety and trust. Robert's reaction was immediate and visceral. He stood up, paced the room, and then sat down heavily, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. "Are you absolutely certain?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When Zephyr nodded, Robert closed his eyes and said, "We're going to the police right now." The investigation that followed moved quickly. Detective Lisa Grant, no relation to Victoria, was a 15-year veteran of the county sheriff's department with specialized training in sexual assault cases. She interviewed Zephyr in a comfortable room at the station with Elena present as his advocate. Zephyr's story was detailed, consistent, and heartbreaking. Detective Grant explained that they would need medical evidence, and that Zephyr would have to undergo testing that might be uncomfortable, but was necessary for building a case. Zephyr agreed, knowing that staying silent would only protect Victoria and potentially put other young people at risk. The medical examination confirmed what Elena had suspected. Zephyr had contracted a sexually transmitted infection that typically showed symptoms within days of exposure. Further testing would reveal the full scope of what Victoria had done to him. When Detective Grant obtained a warrant for Victoria's medical records, the investigation took a devastating turn. Victoria had been diagnosed with HIV 3 years earlier during the final stages of her marriage in Denver. She'd been receiving treatment and her viral load was suppressed, but she'd never disclosed her status to Robert or anyone else in Brookhaven. The implications were staggering. Not only had Victoria sexually assaulted her stepson, but she'd potentially exposed him to a life-threatening virus. The charges against her would include sexual assault, reckless endangerment, and criminal transmission of HIV. Detective Grant had seen many difficult cases in her career, but the calculated nature of Victoria's actions, the grooming, the manipulation, the complete betrayal of trust made this one of the worst. Victoria's arrest took place on a Tuesday morning as she was leaving for her shift at the local library where she volunteered. The sight of patrol cars in their driveway sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Victoria maintained her innocence, claiming Zephyr was lying, that he was angry about some imagined slight and was trying to destroy her marriage to his father. She hired an expensive lawyer from the state capitol and prepared to fight the charges aggressively. Meanwhile, Zephyr faced the dual trauma of dealing with his assault and learning that he might be HIV positive. The waiting period for conclusive test results felt endless, each day bringing new anxiety about his health and his future. Robert struggled with his own guilt and rage, blaming himself for not seeing the signs, for bringing a predator into his son's life. The family that had seemed so perfect just weeks earlier was now completely shattered. The community of Brookhaven rallied around Zephyr and Robert in the weeks following Victoria's arrest. The high school principal arranged for Zephyr to complete his coursework from home so he could graduate with his class. Local businesses donated money for his legal and medical expenses. The pastor at St. Mary's Church, where Victoria had been such an active member, struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the monster revealed by the investigation. But not everyone believed Zephyr's story. Some neighbors whispered that teenage boys couldn't really be victims, that Zephyr must have been a willing participant who was now trying to avoid consequences. These cruel whispers reached Zephyr's ears and added another layer of trauma to his already overwhelming situation. On July 15th, exactly 1 month after prom night, Zephyr received the news he'd been dreading. He had tested positive for HIV. Dr. Emily Park, an infectious disease specialist brought in from the state medical center, explained that with modern treatments, HIV was no longer the death sentence it had once been. Zephyr could live a normal lifespan with proper medication and monitoring. But at 16, facing his senior year of high school and college applications, the diagnosis felt devastating. Zephyr looked at his father sitting beside him in the sterile medical office and saw his own despair reflected in Robert's eyes. "I'm sorry," Zephyr whispered, though he had nothing to apologize for. "I'm so sorry this happened to our family." Victoria's lawyer fought hard to discredit Zephyr's testimony, suggesting that the teenager was confused about what had happened or was lying to get attention. The defense strategy was as cruel as it was predictable. Blame the victim, question his credibility, and suggest that any sexual contact had been consensual.
Victoria herself maintained her innocence, even when confronted with DNA evidence and her own medical records. During a pre-trial hearing, she looked directly at Zephyr and said, "I loved you like my own son. I can't believe you're doing this to me." The manipulation continued, even from jail, as Victoria wrote letters to Robert begging him to believe her, claiming that Zephyr was troubled and had initiated everything that happened. The case received significant media attention, with news vans parked outside the courthouse and reporters trying to interview anyone connected to the family. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about HIV criminalization laws and the complexities of prosecuting sexual assault cases involving teenage victims and adult authority figures. Legal experts weighed in on the charges, with some arguing that Victoria's actions constituted attempted murder, given her knowledge of her HIV status, and others contending that the prosecution was overreaching. For Zephyr, the media circus was another layer of trauma. His private nightmare had become public entertainment, with strangers debating the details of the worst experience of his life. As the trial date approached, Zephyr's behavior began to worry his father and his therapist. The confident, optimistic young man who'd walked into prom night was gone, replaced by someone who was anxious, depressed, and increasingly isolated. Zephyr had nightmares every night, often waking up screaming Victoria's name. He stopped eating regularly and lost dangerous amounts of weight. His friends tried to maintain contact, but Zephyr pushed them away, convinced that his HIV diagnosis made him a danger to others despite medical reassurances to the contrary. Dr. Monica Rivera, the trauma therapist assigned to his case, noted in her files that Zephyr exhibited classic symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder and was at high risk for self-harm. On August 8, 3 days before jury selection was scheduled to begin, Zephyr disappeared. Robert woke up to find his son's bed empty, a note on the pillow that simply read, "I'm sorry for everything. I love you, Dad." Zephyr had taken his father's truck and driven to Willow Pond, the same place where Victoria had assaulted him 2 months earlier. A jogger found him the next morning, sitting on the dock with his feet in the water, staring at the sunrise. When police approached, Zephyr didn't resist. He'd been there all night, he told them, thinking about his mother and what she would want him to do. "She'd want me to be brave," Zephyr said. "She'd want me to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Zephyr's disappearance sparked a community-wide search that ended with relief when he was found safe, but the incident highlighted the severe psychological toll the case was taking on him. Robert made the difficult decision to check Zephyr into a residential treatment facility for trauma recovery, postponing the trial until his son was stable enough to testify. Victoria's lawyer used the delay to argue that Zephyr's mental health issues undermined his credibility, suggesting that his breakdown proved he was unstable and possibly delusional. The legal maneuvering was ruthless, with both sides preparing for a trial that would determine not just Victoria's fate, but the public's understanding of sexual abuse, HIV criminalization, and the nature of consent. During his month in residential treatment, Zephyr slowly began to heal. He worked with therapists who specialized in trauma recovery and connected with other survivors of sexual assault. For the first time since prom night, Zephyr began to understand that what happened to him wasn't his fault, that Victoria's actions were those of a predator who'd carefully planned her attack. He learned about grooming behaviors and realized that Victoria had been manipulating him for months before the assault. The knowledge was both liberating and heartbreaking, as Zephyr recognized how thoroughly he'd been deceived by someone he'd trusted completely. When he returned home in late September, Zephyr was determined to face Victoria in court and tell his story, no matter how difficult it might be. The trial of Victoria Lang began on October 12th in the county courthouse, an imposing brick building that had seen few cases as sensational as this one. Zephyr took the stand on the third day, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was describing. He looked directly at the jury as he recounted the events of prom night, the grooming that preceded it, and the devastating aftermath of his assault. Victoria's lawyer tried to shake his testimony with aggressive cross-examination, but Zephyr held firm. When asked why he hadn't immediately reported what happened, Zephyr gave an answer that silenced the courtroom. "She was supposed to protect me. She was my mother figure." When someone you trust that much hurts you, it takes time to understand that what happened was real, and that it wasn't your fault. The medical evidence was overwhelming. DNA analysis confirmed that Zephyr had contracted HIV from Victoria, with genetic sequencing showing that the virus strains were nearly identical. Comment part 2 for the next episode. Thanks for watching.